He is an attorney and author. He wrote The Knicks 90s, Ewing, Oakley, Starks, and the Brawlers that almost won it all. We welcome to Hoopsology podcast, Paul Knepper. Paul, how you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Matt. I look forward to it.
Thank you so much for joining us. This is a really fun topic for both myself and Justin as kids that really cemented our basketball fanhood from that period of time in the 90s. We were both born in the mid 80s. So this is really kind of when we became, basketball fans. And I wanted to ask you first to start off with about your background as a basketball fan. What got you into the sport? When did you start watching the sport, and kind of what started your basketball fanhood?
Yeah, so I grew up in New York. I lived in Queens till I was 8, and then moved out to Long Island. And I don't know, I played basketball from a young age, and probably around 7, 8, started watching a little bit. I watched a little Knicks. I watched a little St. John's back when St. John's was a powerhouse, and when Chris Mullin was there. And my dad would take me to, 1 or 2 Knicks games a year, 1 or 2 St. John's games a year. And then I got really big into the Knicks, when Rick Pitino got there. So Pitino was the coach from 87 to 89. And 1987, I was 10 years old. And that's kind of when I really got really into them. And, became a big fan of some of the guys like Ewing and Oakley and Mark Jackson, who, of course, carried into the kind of the Pat Riley era, which my book covers.
Awesome. And so getting into the book, and was, what prompted you kind of diving into the extensive research that it takes to doing, writing a book? Was it mostly like, labor of love type thing? What prompted writing the book?
Yeah, it was very much a labor of love. Obviously the last 20 years really have been pretty miserable for the Knicks and Knicks. And so, and Knick fans, myself included, love those 90s teams as we lived through them. And I think there's, the nostalgia for those teams has only grown over the years as the last, as we've there's been really a shortage of quality basketball in New York. So I think about those teams a lot. I long for the days when the Knicks were competitive. And it was really, one day I thought to myself, somebody should really write a book about those teams. They have they're so beloved by New Yorkers and Knicks fans everywhere, really. They were a really good team throughout the decade. I think they were an important team because I think, the league, because of their style of play, the league made a number of rule changes to kind of outlaw a lot of the physicality and fighting, frankly, that they were at the forefront of. So I thought they were important in the league. And there were a lot of, the more I thought about it, I thought, well, there were a lot of great rivalries. The Bulls in the early 90s. Knicks and Pacers met 6 times in the playoffs in those 90s. And at the end of the 90s with Knicks and Miami Heat was pretty heated. And then lastly, my last thought was, because at some point I said, somebody should write a book about this. And at some point I thought, well, why not me? And awesome. So then you start thinking about, okay, is this really a book? Will this make a quality book? And for all the reasons I mentioned, I thought it would. And I think the last thing that really got me, and I think what makes the book work is what makes most books work is that you need good characters. And I felt like they were good characters, with Ewing and Riley and Oakley and Starks and Mason and Jeff Van Gundy and Latrell Sprewell with his whole saga, and Larry Johnson, and was a huge star when he first came to the league, and Charlie Ward, who won the Heisman Trophy, and then became the Knicks starting point guard. So I felt like there were a lot of good characters to kind of use as jumping off points for the story.
Absolutely, 100% agree. Can you, before we get into kind of the precursor to the 90s Knicks, can you just kind of give us an idea of the significance of basketball in New York in general. I'm someone who I've always lived on the West Coast. Right now, Justin and I are best friends. We live in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where we don't have a sports franchise really. So, I mean, Justin loved Bulls from the 90s. I've kind of just, I love the sport of basketball. I've always respected greatness. I have some family down in Houston. So, Olajuwon's one of my favorite players of all time, and I love the Rockets. But can you give us, because I guess from someone on the West Coast who maybe isn't as into the sport of basketball as maybe Justin and myself, you look at the titles that teams in New York have won. And I mean, of course, the Yankees with their success, you'd expect there's a huge Yankees fan base. For the Giants who have won, I believe, 4 Super Bowls. There's been a lot of success there as well. So you might think, oh, New York is probably mostly a baseball town, then football, then basketball. But if you look in the culture, I don't know that that's necessarily the case. Where would you think basketball ranks in New York? And can you just describe that culture to someone who's ignorant and has never been to New York like myself?
Yeah, New York is a basketball town, period. They call basketball the city game, and New York is the biggest city in the country. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think there's something about New York that lends itself to the city, the playgrounds, right? You have the playgrounds in New York City. And of course, there's such a big playground culture. It's not just the Knicks. It's you have Rucker Park, and you have these, all the GOAT, Manigault, and Joe the Destroyer, and Pee Wee Kirkland, all these, playground legends for New York. So you have all that. I as I said, I grew up in Long Island, but I lived in Manhattan for 13 years. And you can't walk more than 10 minutes without seeing a hoop, a basketball. There's something about it, about the city living as well. A lot of certain parts of the city are in poverty, and people can't afford equipment to play football. They don't have the space to build baseball fields, but you can put a hoop anywhere and you can play by yourself. And so that's a lot of kids like, Stephon Marbury, Sebastian Telfair. There are a lot of New Yorkers that didn't have much money, kids from the projects. They always had a place to play basketball, whereas they may not have had access to other sports. The other thing I would say is, as you noted, the Yankees have had a great deal of success. The Giants have had a great deal of success. In addition to basketball, I think being the city game, the Knicks kind of own the city as none of the other major teams did. And so New York is definitely a Yankees town, but there are a lot of Met fans. New York is, the Giants are the number 1 team, but there are a lot of Jet fans. I don't know what the percentage is, but maybe it's 60-40, even if it's 65-35. It's a lot, there's a lot on the other side. The Knicks, until the Nets moved to Brooklyn, I don't know what year that was now, 10 years ago, whenever that was. Knicks had the 5 boroughs. They had New York City to themselves. And that's where New Jersey and, even New Jersey, most people rooted for the Knicks. They just kind of had the whole city to themselves. So when they were winning, everyone was on board, more so than even, when the Yankees are winning. It's a weird thing with New York, which I think a lot of people don't understand, is that it's like you pick a team and you hate the other one. So if you're a Yankee fan, you hate the Mets. If you're a Giant fan, you hate the Jets, and vice versa. So when the Giants are winning, yes, that 60 to 65% of the city is pumped, but a lot of the city is like, I don't, screw the Giants. Same with the Yankees and Mets. The Knicks, that number is for New York City and surrounding suburbs, that number is in the 90s. So they own the city in a way that no other team has. So you combine that with the percentage of people that are into it, with the fact that it is kind of the heart blood of the city, of the game of basketball. People just go crazy in New York when the Knicks are playing well.
Gotcha. So the stage for I guess everything that follows and sets up the '90s Knicks. I mean, it's kind of impossible to distinguish the '90s Knicks from Patrick Ewing, right? I mean, he's as a player the centerpiece of that team. So of course, the Knicks, the last title that they won was in 1973. There's like a 12-year gap there between winning that title and the Knicks drafting Patrick Ewing. There's a lot of fun stuff to read about with that. There's of course the lottery draft pick conspiracy about Patrick Ewing, which is kind of funny and fun to talk about. But I kind of wanted to get your feel on what was the fan base like, what were expectations like, and how big was drafting Patrick Ewing? I mean, was this something that like the fan base interest was pretty steady and this just heightened that? Was this something that reignited the fan base? What was all that like?
Yeah, I think the passion's always there for New York fans, and you can see it even in the last few years. It's remarkable that the Knicks could be playing. The Knicks could have the third worst record in the league, and they could be playing a meaningless game in the first weekend in April, and the crowd is going crazy in a tight game in the final 2 minutes. So there is. I think the fan base there is always engaged, but the level of excitement when they got Patrick off the charts, and it's hard to explain to people exactly, the magnitude of that because. For one, Patrick was, I mean, like LeBron, Zion Williamson, that kind of level, star. People calling him the next Bill Russell. That's who he was compared to most often. He was one of those guys that is a no doubt first pick, far and away. Everyone thought he was going to win multiple championships in the NBA. That was the thinking. And the thing about it too was back then. Patrick played 4 years in college, 4 years college basketball. Guys did that, and he won one championship. He lost in the championship game 2 other times. So imagine if you saw LeBron or Zion play 4 years in college, and you got to see that on a weekly, over 4 years. Just the recognition. I mean, those guys were so big without LeBron. Didn't play college. Zion only played 1 year, and they were so recognizable. Imagine having a guy of that magnitude play 4 years, how much excitement that would generate, how much name recognition that would be. And so when he was drafted, Sports Illustrated wrote an article. He's the most highly acclaimed athlete. I think they called the most highly acclaimed athlete to ever enter professional sports.
Wow.
Like he was just that big a deal. And so it was huge, when they won that lottery. And it was, back then, the lottery, it wasn't a weighted lottery. So there were only 7 teams in the lottery. Each team had an equal percent chance. I think it was like 14.3% chance of winning. So it wasn't like the Knicks went in as favorites and people were expecting it. It was a surprise, and it was like, wow, well, like we're back. This is it. We're back. We're going to win championships again.
Wow. And so, I mean, the New York media scene, especially back at that time, is legendary as being, just kind of like a pressure cooker. So, I mean, I'd imagine that, the intensity and focus placed on that team just blew up after Patrick Ewing had been drafted. And given that he had, I believe he had some injuries his rookie year, but still won Rookie of the Year award, and then came back, had strong seasons after that, and I mean, pretty much throughout the '90s, if we're being honest. But was there a difference, or I guess, what was the difference between the pressure from the media after Patrick Ewing was drafted, and then maybe the media focus and attention that Pat Riley brings to the team when he joined in '91? Was it kind of just a compounded thing, or about equal the whole time?
That's a good question. I think initially it was bigger for Patrick because he was the player. As big of a personality as Riley was, Patrick was the player, and just. So I think that was bigger, but it wasn't level the whole time. So, Patrick, it was disappointing. They were bad his first few years there. I mean, people thought they were going to be instant contenders, and they were bad. And so I think a lot of the enthusiasm dissipated over his first several years there, and they were kind of a lost franchise a little bit. I think, Patrick played for, I think it was 5 coaches in his first 6 years.
Wow.
There was a lot of turnover, a lot of new coaches, a lot of new general managers, presidents. And I think the fan base was frustrated and a little disillusioned with the direction of the team and to an extent with Patrick. So the hype had definitely died down, and Riley's arrival rekindled it.
Gotcha. Well, what was that transition like? I mean, we have Riley, who is the coach of the Showtime Lakers, obviously has a ton of success with the Showtime Lakers. What was that like initially for him coming over to the Knicks in 91? I mean, I would argue even today, we still have kind of like this West Coast, East Coast, friendly kind of rivalry between the coasts. What was that like? And how was he able to transition from coming to the Showtime Lakers to kind of more like a, hardworking Knicks East Coast team? I mean, was it just as simple as like, hey, check out my rings? Or how was he able to, I guess, garner favor with the fans in the city of New York?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he was quite as brash about it. Allegedly, when he met with LeBron James, when he was recruiting him to come to Miami, he took all his rings and threw them on the table, literally. He wasn't quite that bold about it. But I mean, certainly in the locker room, there's that instant, respect. There's that instant, there's a certain gravitas, a certain cachet that comes with that kind of success. So I think he had instant respect from the fans, certainly from his players, all around. It was interesting, as you note, because people were like, he's known as the Showtime Lakers, up and down, fast-paced basketball. I talked to Rudy Tomjanovich in my book, and who coached the Rockets, and he coached against Riley in the 94 finals. And Rudy T told me, the measure of a great coach is a coach who could win with different styles of play, win different ways. And he said, and Pat did that. He showed he could do that in New York. I think Riley, very astutely looked at his personnel and said, I don't have Magic Johnson. Mark Jackson was a good point guard. He was a Magic Johnson. I don't have Magic Johnson here. I don't have James Worthy, a forward who could run the floor like that. I have Patrick Ewing and Charles Oakley, 2 big, bruising, physical interior players. The other thing which Riley talked about a little bit was he felt that was the way the league was going. That the Lakers were dethroned by the bad boy Pistons. And he felt that actually, as much success as he had running Showtime, he thought the way to win in the league now is through tough, hard-nosed physical play and defense. And so I think it was part that was the personnel he had, and part that he felt that was kind of the way to do it now.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's great. One of my questions actually here for you was, how much did the Bad Boy Pistons influence how that roster was built? So, I mean, it sounds like, of course, we had tough physical basketball in the 80s. That kind of continued with the Knicks through the 90s. I mean, how do they kind of compare and contrast with those Bad Boys Pistons? I mean, I would say, for one thing, there really maybe isn't this sense of a villain, at least from my perspective, and maybe I'm wrong. It isn't really a sense of a villain, kind of like Bill Laimbeer on the Bad Boy Pistons. But were the Knicks and the way they were built purely kind of influenced by this physical 80s basketball? Or, were they trying to put a new spin on that in some ways?
Yeah, I think they were. I think they very much were. But not in a vacuum. In other words, like, sure, you had Patrick Ewing, a great interior player, and you had Oakley wasn't as reviled as Laimbeer, but he was that tough enforcer who led the league in flagrant fouls a number of seasons, that kind of thing. He was like that. So I think part of it was that was kind of what he had to work with. And then Anthony Mason was in camp that year, who was like that. Xavier McDaniel was very tough. A lot of it was personnel based. But yes, Riley was very, as I alluded to before, he was very influenced by the Pistons and did want to play that style of play. Again, personnel is an issue. If he had Michael Jordan, Scottie Pippen, he played differently. If he had, even if he had like a Portland team of Clyde Drexler and Terry Porter, a backcourt like that, he probably would have played it differently and played a more faster paced game up and down the court, that kind of thing. So it's a mixture, I think, of what he had on hand and what he thought would work.
Definitely, yeah. And I think there's even, interviews with like Coach Popovich where he talks about, playing to your strengths. So it sounds like,
right.
That's exactly where Pat Riley was going with that. Makes a lot of sense. I wanted to get just your personal opinion as someone who did a ton of research on this team for this book and someone who is a devoted Knicks fan. I mean, for one thing, what was your favorite Knicks team, your favorite Knicks roster? And then, I guess maybe the answer is obvious that it's when they were in the 94 finals against the Rockets. But when did you feel this team was closest to winning the title? I mean, I know in terms of like distance, games left, maybe that 94 finals team is the obvious answer. But so I guess, maybe first let's just say, when do you feel like this team was closest? When did they have the best chance?
Yeah, well, clearly they were closest. I'll make a distinction. So they were closest, obviously, in 94, right? They got to Game 7 in the finals. A lot of people forget the end of Game 6. The Knicks were down 2. John Starks lined up a three-pointer, and Starks was on fire. Starks had 16 points in that fourth quarter. He lined up a three-pointer, and Akeem Olajuwon made an incredible play to just get his fingertip on that ball, and it fell short. And that was at the buzzer. I mean, that was a championship-winning shot. So you can't get any closer, right?
Right.
That was the closest. I maintain, and I know a number of guys from those Knicks teams believe, that the 1993 team was actually better than the 94 team. And the 93 team lost in the conference finals to the Bulls. It's remembered very much for Game 5, which is known as the Charles Smith game, when Charles Smith was rejected 4 times in the closing seconds. Of course, the following year in 94, yes, they made it to Game 7 in the finals. They beat the Bulls, but Michael wasn't there, right? So they got further, but it was an easier path. The 93 team won more games. They won 60 games. They had the number 1 seed over the Bulls that year. And so I actually, they just, you can't say it was much better, and it was very similar roster, but they just seemed to be a little more connected, a little more locked in, than in 94.
Got you. And, personally, your favorite to watch, I know fans, you always have like those guys that you root for, those guys that are near and dear to your heart, maybe even if they're not as successful as some of the other rosters. What would be your favorite Knicks roster that you've seen?
Tough
to pick.
The 93 and 94 teams, because they played so hard every night. Those teams were 93 and 94.
So after Pat Riley left the team, I believe that was right after that 94 season, right?
The summer of 95.
95, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. So after Pat Riley leaves, they're still sustained success on this Knicks team. Through, really every single season they are in it. And then even in 99, even with Pat Ewing getting injured during the playoffs, they managed from the 8th seed amazingly to make it all the way to the finals against the Spurs. I remember very vividly watching that NBA finals in particular, because Latrell Sprewell was so entertaining, of course. I loved watching Marcus Camby. To me, it just felt like almost every single rebound, he was tipping it in with a dunk. Like, that was just a thing that one of my first experiences to tip in dunks was Marcus Camby. He's like forever tied to that for me. What were they able to do? I know Jeff Van Gundy had been on as an assistant under Pat Riley, and I believe even before that, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So he kind of takes the reins, and was it just this continuity that they had in their coaching that made them able to sustain this success?
So there was a weird little interlude actually. When Riley left, he was replaced by Don Nelson.
Right.
And Van Gundy stayed on as assistant coach. And Nelly had a great reputation, was a 3-time coach of the year. His tenure in New York was a disaster. He only lasted 55 games, I'm sorry. Their record wasn't that bad, but he was feuding with Patrick, he was feuding with Starks. It wasn't working at all. He got very much away from what they were doing, their identity, which was defense, working hard, playing through Patrick. And Van Gundy took over for Nelson, and it was like a return to normalcy. He kind of went back to everything Riley did, including using a lot of the exact same plays with the same names, and reverted back to that. So yeah, I mean, the reason I think they remain competitive is a couple things. Definitely Van Gundy's coaching. You had Ewing was the constant, who was there throughout. The star player who everyone kind of followed his lead. The other thing was they did a good job of kind of rebuilding on the fly a couple times. I don't know if you would say rebuilding because they weren't bad at retooling. So in 1996, the summer of '96, they signed a new starting backcourt. They signed Chris Childs. Derek Harper got old, and they let him leave, and they brought in Chris Childs and Allen Houston. Houston added a whole new dimension to the team because they really didn't have a knockdown shooter before that. They also traded Anthony Mason for Larry Johnson that summer. So they kind of retooled, and that gave them, made them a little younger, a little more offensive firepower. And then again in '99, as you were talking, you named the two guys, Sprewell and Camby. Before that season, they traded Starks and Oakley, who were both getting older and slowing down, and got Camby and Sprewell in return. So really in '96, and then again in '98, '99, they kind of turned over the roster, retooled a little bit, and that's what enabled them to keep it going. And then, of course, you have the constants of Van Gundy coaching really in Riley's image, and Ewing at the forefront.
Yeah, very much reminds me of a team in the Boston Celtics of late that has been doing that kind of consistent retooling. Famously, Danny Ainge didn't really get, at least didn't appear to be super emotionally tied to Isaiah Thomas. Got a lot of criticism for trading him away in some ways, but seems like from a roster development standpoint, it was the smart move to do. I mean, unfortunately, Isaiah Thomas had those injuries he dealt with and everything.
Sure.
How were those moves, trading away, I mean, big names like Anthony Mason, Charles Oakley? Is that something, you see the Knicks fans like booing on draft night if they're unsatisfied with the pick. I mean, these are guys that the fans loved. I mean, especially thinking of Mason and Charles Oakley in particular, and John Starks at a lot of times too. I mean, was this met with a lot of criticism from the fan base? Or I know New York fans are also very smart basketball fans too. So do you think there was this emotional tie that caused a lot of anger, or was there understanding of the plan?
Yeah,
probably mixed.
I think each trade was a little different. There was a mixture on each end. I think a mixture of emotions, even within individual Knicks fans, for myself as well. Starting with the Mason trade, Mason was a crowd favorite. New York loved him. He was tough. He was hard-nosed. He was from Queens. He was a New Yorker. We kind of developed him out of nowhere. So people were very sad to see him go. It helped that you got a big name in return in Larry Johnson. You weren't trading him for you weren't trading for cap space or future compensation or draft picks. It was Larry Johnson, who wasn't the same player that he had been, but a lot of people were excited about the idea of Larry Johnson. And so I think there were somewhat mixed feelings about that trade. The least controversial, I would say, certainly was the Sprewell deal. Ironically, I mean, Sprewell himself was a tremendous controversy, but I think among the fan base, it was viewed as really a very low risk move. And Starks was one of the most loved Knicks ever. So I think everyone was sad to see him go, but I don't think anyone really thought it was a bad trade, right? And that, hey, Sprewell is, he's an all-star, and Starks is getting older, and he's not where he was a few years ago. And if we could get this guy for Starks and, some other crap, like basically we're getting him at a discount because he strangled his coach. I think people were okay parting with Starks for that. The Oak thing too was mixed feelings because Oak was so loved, is still so loved, and but Camby had been this number 2 pick in the draft just a couple years earlier, and was about 10 years younger. So I remember mixed feelings with that too. That hey, I don't know if Camby's ready to step into this role that Oakley had and be the player Oakley was, but this is a move for the future. And so people were, I think for the most part, on board with that.
Gotcha. Yeah, and it seems to me like it was a different time in being an NBA GM where you could maybe get a lot more for a big name that was on the decline as far as their remaining years left in the league or potential athleticism that they had left. It seems a lot different back then than it is now, where every single trade is, and maybe that's of course expanded media, social media, etc. Everything is so scrutinized nowadays, but it seems like tons of smart moves for the Knicks there to keep that sustained greatness. I wanted to ask you, kind of segueing into, after Patrick Ewing leaves the team, we get into sort of the fall of the Knicks, I guess you could say. I don't want to dwell on this for too long, but would you attribute the past 20 years of the Knicks to simply mismanagement? Overspending on, guys that didn't pan out, things like that? Or is there more to it than simply, front office mismanagement?
I think it's the front office. Yeah.
Hard to say otherwise.
Yeah. I saw, I remember who said it. I think it was a Knicks writer said on Twitter, if the team is bad for a year or two, maybe it's the coach. If the team is bad for 3 or 4 years, maybe it's the general manager. If the team is bad for 20 years, it's the owner. And yeah, it's James Dolan has brought in the wrong people to run the team. And in the couple of occasions where he's brought in okay people, he didn't give them the freedom to do the job, and he interfered and got in the way. Look, there's been some bad luck along the way. There's always, when you're really good, you get some good luck. Sometimes the ping pong ball bounces your way, and when you're really bad, it usually part of it is bad luck as well, and injuries and this and that. But yeah, so it's there's been this approach of chasing big names, whether it be a player, in going back to Antonio McDyess, who was coming off terrible knee problems, to Marbury, to Melo, to Amari, to whoever, just always chasing that big name, with coaches as well, and front office. Phil Jackson really wasn't the right man for that job. But no disrespect to Phil Jackson, magnificent coach, but it's hard to become a president of a team and be responsible for personnel at he was 70 years old. To start, that's a tough job. But he was a big name, and the same with the coaches. There was Larry Brown, and there was Mike D'Antoni, and there was those guys were wonderful coaches, but it was like they just didn't get it, that you need to build a culture, that you need to cultivate young players and young assets, and you can't just go for names.
Yeah, and even today or last night, maybe it was. The rumor had been around for a few days. The Knicks are getting Derrick Rose. It looks like,
Right.
which makes me very hesitant because I was really happy to see the Knicks kind of hovering around that 8 seed area, even higher than that at the start of the season. So it does make me nervous to bring in Thibodeau guy. Who is well past his prime, not his fault in many cases. Of course, we know the horrible injuries Derrick Rose has dealt with and stuff like that. But really, just gives me pause that are the Knicks back to old habits of the 2000s when it looked like there might have been this growth happening. Time will tell, of course. I wanted to circle back and get your thoughts on Patrick Ewing and his relationship with the New York media in particular, and his star at large, because we saw a couple of years later, I believe Shaq was drafted 6 years after Patrick Ewing, if I'm not mistaken. I might be off by a year or two there, but Shaq is, of course, this big personality, becomes a megastar, and listeners, if you are 25 and under, I would say maybe even 30 and under, and a casual NBA fan, you probably don't realize the gigantic stars that big men were, like throughout the 80s and the 90s. I mean, this was really talk about building the roster was centered around, well, who is your big? Part of the reason, as you and I discussed, Paul, that it was such big news for the Knicks to get Patrick Ewing and why that was such a big deal.
Right.
So Patrick Ewing seems like he's always been reserved. I mean, he's had some TV appearances, media appearances, things like that. Of course, now he's head coach of Georgetown, which is awesome. But can you just describe like his relationship with the media? I know he dealt with a lot of adversity through college. Requiem for the Big East, for example, that 30 for 30 chronicles kind of some of the racism that he dealt with as a youngster during that time he was with Georgetown. I mean, do you think that contributes to him keeping himself maybe a little bit more reserved? Was his relationship with the New York media friendly, adversarial? I don't know. I'll be quiet. If you could just give me your thoughts on his relationship with the media.
No, that's a great point. It was, I would say it was somewhat adversarial. At the very least, it was not adversarial, maybe just a little cold, distant. He always kept his distance. He didn't really let people in. His teammates and close friends, yes, but not the media and not the fans. And it was interesting because, the mid 80s, he came in the league in 85. It was really the time the league was exploding in popularity. For a number of reasons, right? You had David Stern had just become commissioner a year earlier. Of course, you had Michael Jordan came in the league a year earlier. The 80s was really when the league became, started to become what it is today. Magic and Bird, cable television wasn't really big until the 80s, so there was much more exposure. And there were a lot more dollars as a result. There was a lot more money available. And most of the star players of the time, you think of Magic and Michael and Charles Barkley and others were pining for that attention and that money, and Patrick wanted no part of it. Jack McCallum of who used to write for Sports Illustrated referred to Patrick as the reluctant superstar. Patrick would have been content playing in an empty gym every night. He didn't need it. He didn't need the accolades. He didn't need the attention. He wanted it because I think he wanted the money and the endorsements like everyone else, but it just wasn't. It was his personality. I think Patrick is shy by nature. I definitely think some of the things you touched on, in addition to being shy, he experienced a lot of racism as in high school, in college. Patrick was an immigrant. Patrick came to the United States at age 12 from Jamaica, and was made fun of a lot as a kid for someone because of his accent, the way he talked, and I think that caused him to pull inward a little bit as well. And he was a little self-conscious about his accent, so he wasn't anxious to do interviews. So yeah, when a lot of guys, back then wanted to have the camera and microphone in front of him as much as possible, he didn't want it at all, and was very reluctant to do one-on-one interviews. He was very strict with when he was willing to talk to the media. Gave a lot less access. Now he's professional. I don't want to. He never
sure.
blew off a media session, and I give him a lot of credit for that, because as a lone star on a team in New York City, that's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
And even when they were losing, he took the questions every day, but he said, like, I'll give you 5 minutes, and then he gave 5 minutes, and that was it. And then he was out. So yeah, he was standoffish in that way, and was portrayed, I think, sometimes as rude and by the media. And the fans picked up on that as well. He kind of had a scowl on the court, and you didn't get the other side of it, right? He had that major intensity and anger, but Michael Jordan had that, and Kobe would have that. But then they go in the press conference and they flash that $1 million smile and, talk about whatever they talked about and schmooze the media a little bit, and it was all good. Patrick didn't do that. He didn't want to do it. It wasn't his personality. And so I think he did, he had a kind of rocky relationship with the media, and as a result with the fans.
Gotcha. Yeah, and some might say that being more reserved and back with the media is just plain smart.
Yeah.
I mean, depending on what your goals are, what you're trying to accomplish.
There was something about him that I don't know, because as you say that, I'll bring up another name. Derek Jeter was very reserved with the media. He didn't give you anything. I mean, he was like cardboard in interviews. But I don't know. He managed to navigate that better than Patrick did. He didn't play with that anger on the field, so maybe that wasn't that that kind of perception to begin with. I'm not sure why exactly, but Patrick just wasn't able to pull that off the way Jeter did.
Yeah, maybe some weight lift off of Jeter after having won a World Series.
Yes.
I don't know, purely speculative.
Absolutely.
What do you think? I know this is hypotheticals, but what do you think a title for the Knicks in the 90s does to elevate Patrick Ewing's star and just kind of position as a legendary big in the league?
Oh, tremendously. I mean, there's that list that everyone runs down, right? Ewing and Karl Malone and John Stockton and Charles Barkley, and go back earlier to Elgin Baylor and whoever, and he's not on that list. Yeah, it's amazing, right? I mentioned that Stark shot at the end of Game 6. If that shot goes in, it's Patrick's legacy is so different, and I think the way he is viewed in New York in a large extent is very different. I think he's the most underappreciated superstar in New York sports history. And I think that changes, that whole narrative changes if he wins the championship, and all the frustration that Knicks fans had, and all the, there was that distance with him and the fans, and at times conflict even with him and the fans, that all fades away with the championship. And I think it would be very different.
Gotcha. Yeah. I mean, I think if there's one 90s star, I mean, everyone talks about Barkley and those guys that you mentioned, but man, it would have been so impactful for Patrick Ewing, a guy who spent practically his entire career on the Knicks. You really feel for him, even as someone like myself who has no skin in the games for the Knicks. Really, just his story is so incredible. So one last question for you, Paul, and I really appreciate your time and joining us for this interview. I wanted to ask you about the modern day Nets. This is a question we've been thrown around with some of our guests from the East Coast. We've talked to younger guests who are like guys in their early 20s, because I wanted their perspective on what does Madison Square Garden mean to you, what does this culture mean to you, etc. Is there any credence to the idea that the Brooklyn Nets can garner favor with New York fans, can kind of like talk of the Clippers being the team in LA, which seems pretty ridiculous given the history in that city? Would you say the same thing holds true with the Nets? Like, let's say the Nets hypothetically win 2 of the next 4, a la the Miami Heat Big 3, which maybe the chances are pretty low even of that. But is there any chance that the culture changes in New York with performance like that?
I think, like, if they do that, if they win 2 championships, I think they siphon off a number of the young fans, right? Certainly kids. They're not gonna become New York's team. Not anytime soon, not for generations. Just because the Knicks go back generations, right? They're one of the original teams. They go back to 1946. That's generations upon generations. It's almost in your blood, right? Your parents watch the Knicks. Your grandpa watched the Knicks. Location matters. The Knicks are in Midtown Manhattan, kind of at the epicenter of it all. And Brooklyn is great. And I mean, Brooklyn is totally different than when I was a kid right now, Brooklyn. But Brooklyn is cool. It's a place to be. It's not Midtown Manhattan. So I think there's a little difference there that it's not Madison Square Garden. So I don't think they will ever become the team. But, for young people, when you're growing up and, if how the Knicks do will impact that as well. I don't think it's, if they win the next two championships, but the Knicks become a very good team as well, that will hold on to some of the fan base. But for kids, if you're 10, 11 years old right now and you're first getting into basketball and the Nets are on national TV a lot more. They're getting the high exposure, and you see them in the playoffs, and they win championships, and they have Durant and Harden and Kyrie, and the Knicks are maybe mediocre. Yeah, I think they'll get a lot of young kids. I don't think they're going to get. I don't think many people are going to switch over, but I think they will get young kids in and around the city, and we'll see how that goes over generations.
Absolutely. Well, Paul, it was an absolute pleasure talking to you. Really enjoyed the conversation. Please plug for the good listeners projects you're working on, where they can find you on social media, and please make sure to check out his books.
Paul, go ahead. So, well, let me first say, Matt, I really enjoyed this as well. Thank you so much for having me on. Thanks to Justin too. I'm not going to plug anything yet. I haven't decided. Sure, I think I have a new book topic, but I'm not sure, so I'm going to hold off on announcing that.
Awesome.
But stay tuned. Follow me on Twitter at PaulieKnep. That's PauliekNep. You can follow me there, and I have plenty of Knicks stuff and basketball stuff in general, and we'll have projects in the future.
Awesome. Sounds great, Paul. Well, take care. Have a great rest of your Sunday, and thanks again for joining the show.
All right. Thanks, Matt. Take care.